in Belarus. Um, there's not much reporting on this right now, but appears that there have been multiple explosions across different areas of Belarus. Initial reports that are unconfirmed say that it is a Belarusian military exercise. My questions for the panel are: do we believe that? Could there be some rogue elements within the Belarusian army that are disgruntled because of new Russian commanders taking over? Or if this is a Belarusian military exercise, what does it signal for potential action coming from the north?
If I could just start, it's DoDar here. I don't draw too many conclusions from this personally. From what I've seen, the intel is really, really limited um, in terms of what's solid, what's bulletproof, and what we know for sure. Um, I try to assess things from bottom bar, top bar in terms of worst case scenario, best case scenario, extreme to not so extreme. I think the bottom bar of the situation is that it is just a military exercise. And although there's lots of stuff going on and you get into the habit of wanting to dig deeper and find out the truth, as we all should have that kind of motivation, it's important not to speculate too much on things when there's such limited intel. And my conclusion would be that it is just a military exercise. At least that would be my stance currently. If it's not and it's other things, we've just got to keep our ear to the ground and look out for more information, as I'm doing myself, and I'm sure other people here are also doing. But yeah, that's my take on that.
I just heard that it was like Belarusian military exercises and that they are launching artillery. That's the only report that I've had on it so far. However, we've had other inconsistent information coming our way about the situation. There were reports that some individuals had called some of the local authorities there on the ground, and that they had basically said, "Oh, there's nothing going on," and they had kind of it looked like they were kind of trying to cover their tracks. Again, we had reports light up all across Belarus on Live UA Map earlier tonight. And for about the first hour, the only report was, A, there was explosions, and B, for everything else was unconfirmed at that time. Again, the only other report that I've seen so far is that it's possibly from these military exercises. What's interesting, though, is that these explosions were captured in all of these different cities in Belarus.
So I've actually just got a video here. I'm just gonna bob that in the writing room for you.
I think one of the things with Belarus is they have said that well, we know that the Belarusians are um, technically proxies of Russia. Whether or not this is signs of things to come or a military exercise, I guess that's something interesting. Though I did watch a interview with the opposition leader who has proclaimed herself leader of Belarus. And she said that there are, in that interview, which was about a week or two ago, that there are elements of the Belarusian army who want to fight in Ukraine. So I don't know to the extent of what, to extent of that is happening, but yeah, that would be interesting.
Vlad, if you wouldn't mind, could you boost up your microphone just a little bit too? I got you at like 200% here, and I think you're coming in just a little quiet. I'm not sure if we can hear you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Is this better?
Oh no, that is much better. In fact, I should probably turn you down now a little bit.
Excellent.
Awesome, that's good. Continue on. Maybe if you just want to reiterate what you were just saying there.
Just to reiterate, I mean, I think the president of Belarus is in a tough spot. He's basically a puppet now to Putin. So if he wanted to go into Ukraine with his forces, he could. I'm sure that Putin is behind the scenes saying to him to go in. I think there's a lot of from watching an interview with the opposition leader, who's currently in England. She said herself that there are elements of the Belarusian army that want to fight for Ukraine and others who want to fight for Russia. So there might be a split in the military in terms of who they actually believe they should be fighting for, above and beyond the presidential office. So I think that's interesting, and yeah, hopefully this isn't a prelude to them being involved. But considering Putin has asked Syrians to come along and even people from Africa, I wouldn't be surprised that if these forces do go into Ukraine at some stage. Though at the moment, I mean, we'll have to see what goes on.
So we kind of see like a split, very similar to what's happening kind of with the Chechen forces as well. Some want to fight for Ukraine, some want to fight for Russia. Um, I definitely we will. I think this is just again my kind of gut feeling on this. I do think we will see some kind of involvement here from these Belarusian forces eventually. If it's in a limited capacity or if it's in the form of a full incursion. A full joint incursion by the Belarusian army, that remains to be seen. But I think it's also possible that we could see that breakaway region Transnistria also get involved as well. I definitely think that's within well within the realm of possibility.
Haven't there been multiple reports of explosions in Belarus in the past weeks? I think there was a report the other day from Russia top brass along the lines that Ukrainian forces had bombed parts of Ukraine. I mean, not Ukraine, but Belarus. I don't know if you guys remember hearing that, but
Yeah, so the speculation on that was, well, this is where it gets a bit fog of war, where you've got one side saying one thing and one side saying another, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole. But I think the general breakdown on that was, um, Ukraine was saying, I'm laughing not because I find it funny. I'm laughing because it's almost so stereotypical of what we're seeing time and time again. That basically planes took off from Russia, flew into Ukrainian airspace, turned around, attacked, took off from Belarus, sorry, flew into Ukrainian airspace, turned around, attacked Belarus, and then landed in Belarus again. And then the other speculation is that obviously Ukraine itself actually attacked Belarus. And the motivation behind this was, of course, that it would drag Belarus into the conflict in some kind of way. And up to this point, they don't seem to have responded to that.
So I think we've reached the limit of speculation on what could possibly be signaled by these explosions. So I'd like to move on to the largest topic of the day. Earlier today, President Zelensky was telecast live to the United States Congress. If you haven't already watched his speech, I highly recommend doing it. Because of some of the graphic nature involved with some of the segments of his speech, we're unable to post it on Discord, but it's available anywhere you go looking for it. The United States Congress today and President Biden announced an $800 million aid package. So we're discussing some of the implications of that. It seems like so far the most effective heavy weapons, and I'm not talking man portable, I'm talking large platforms, that Ukraine have used to this point have been the S-300 and the Bayraktar drone. Do we know the quantity of S-300 platforms that are currently in theater? And do we know the number of platforms that coalition countries have available to donate? Are there any other high altitude S-300 like SAM platforms that the Ukrainians already train on that coalition forces could gift to Ukraine?
So
Um,
I just saw a report that said that we're in talks with Slovakia about their S-300 systems going to Ukraine. And then I think it was our Secretary of Defense or someone from the Pentagon was asked today, what other large systems could we send to Ukraine other than the S-300s? And the statement was, we will not be releasing that information. So I don't have any ideas of what they could be sending.
Yeah, it's a tricky problem because the S-300 is no longer being manufactured in the West or outside of Russia. So sourcing additional missiles and sourcing additional launch platforms is a challenge. I believe Greece has a single platform. I believe Bulgaria has 10. Other than that, I'm unaware.
I think that there's going to be plenty of countries from the Eastern Bloc countries that have joined NATO that are going to probably offer their systems up. If no other reason, then it will put U.S. troops in their country with Patriot systems or something similar. And that's going to be the trade off, most likely. You know, a tit for tat. If we give them these, you guys have to cover us until we can get new systems and get trained on them.
I'd just like to read a bit of an extract, and it's from an article by H. Ram Online. It's just a random article. I'm not, endorsing them in any way, but it's a bit of a breakdown on the Slovakia situation, discussing the S-300s. This is actually from 4 hours ago. The headline is Slovakia to discuss Thursday providing Ukraine with S-300 defense systems. I'm going to make it quick and nice and short here. Slovakia defense officials expect to discuss a possible transfer of their Soviet-era S-300 air defense systems to Ukraine when U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin visits there on Thursday. A Slovakian military spokesperson said. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky mentioned the S-300S by name when he spoke to U.S. lawmakers by video Wednesday, appealing for anti-air systems that would allow Ukraine to, quote, close the skies. So we're seeing again that narrative of, this predominant push for anti-air and air superiority, which we're seeing time and time again is a major concern of the Ukraine military's strategy at the moment. Slovak Defense Ministry spokesperson Martina Koval, I'm going to butcher that name, so I'll just spell it Kakascikova, said Slovaks expect the issue to be on the agenda when Austin comes to Bratislava for talks. So it's definitely on the table. It's definitely currently ongoing. So that's something we'll have to keep an eye on as we move into today or tomorrow, depending what time zone you're in. And so there's a lot that's in the pot boiling at the moment that I'm sure that we're going to find out sooner rather than later what direction that's moving in.
Also, I don't know if anybody had read that we're in talks to give Egypt F-16s. And Egypt happens to have a lot of S-300s. And the insinuation in an article I read was that it was a trade. We'll get you the F-16s if you hand over the S-300s, is the insinuation from an article. There's no confirmation of that.
Wasn't that the original plan with Poland and the U.S.? Weren't they going to trade the F-16s for some old Soviet fighters that they were going to give to Ukraine?
Yes, that was originally what was going to go on with the MiG-29s. It's F-15s. I'm sorry, F-15 Eagles are what we're. But see, the thing is to get those to Egypt, they've still got to be approved by our congressional bodies. So
I don't want to go too far off track with this, but we was actually discussing this away from a situation room as we're doing now live. One of the topics of discussion, which does tie into what we're talking about in terms of what kind of aid we're providing, is the general attitude towards military aid that we're providing. And now predominantly, if you're to paint a shape of the strategic capabilities of what we're actually giving Ukraine, it's predominantly defensive. Now, providing jet fighters is stepping into a territory of potentially offensive weaponry, which I think is a massive contributing factor to why US has been quite hesitant in terms of endorsing that movement, despite the Eastern Bloc's willingness to do this.
well, now we are in this aid package. We the word is we're going to be giving them S3 and S6, S300, S600 switchblades which are offensive weapons.
One thing I wanted to add is there's many different variants of the S300. So the just for I think clarity's sake, because when you say S300, talking about a whole family of anti-aircraft weapons. The one that Slovakia has, from my research, is the S300 PMU. Now, the PMU has a aerodynamic target range between 5 and 90 kilometers, and ballistic at most 35 kilometers. Whereas the Egyptians, which I think is a really good point, Omni, have some more recent and newer ones, the S300 VMs or the NT2500, which were given by Ukraine, by Russia, my apologies, in a billion-dollar deal to them back in 2014. That has an aerodynamic range of between 200 to 400 kilometers. So I would see probably these S300s definitely being deployed in somewhere like Western Europe above Lviv, or and around there, particularly because you've got humanitarian corridors there, people fleeing into Poland, but also because Lviv's kind of seen as a safe haven at the moment, even though it's already, there's bombs falling close by. So yeah, I just wanted to note that there's some of the S300s are not very useful, whereas some of them are.
Well, if
So
the Egyptian S300s have that kind of range, they could use them toward eastern Ukraine, and they could start shooting down the bombers launching the cruise missiles from Russia, possibly.
which is a critical part of Ukrainian air defense. I'd like to move on a little bit. Do we think that the United States and European Union should be purchasing Bayraktar drones from Turkey to donate to Ukraine? Or do we think that the new Switchblade aid package will fill the gap of Ukrainian offensive capabilities?
Needs to be a combination of both. They both have their uses. I mean, the Switchblade's a loitering munition, as they've got a range of 12 miles with it. With the Bayraktar, they can hit multiple targets. The Switchblade's good for one, so I think it would be a combination, considering the Bayraktars are relatively cheap in the grand scheme of it.
That's true, but I feel like a priority of Russian air offensive has been denying airfields to Ukraine, so that limits their ability to launch.
Yeah.
But that
I,
Bayraktar's so small, they could launch it from any roadway. It doesn't really need a true runway. All they need is a short road to launch it, I would think.
I think the line that you have to draw between defensive and offensive capabilities of Ukraine in the current situation on the ground is a very thick line, to say the least, in terms of what Ukraine's capabilities are of actually pushing the Russian front back in its current state, and discussing whether or not switchblades are going to sufficiently meet a demand for offensive capability is is laughable at best, in the sense of offensive capability, because a switchblade is only going to do so much, and this is why jets are such a superior step up in that direction.
The difference is, though, is the Switchblade's man portable. Any soldier that's trained to fly a drone can carry those with their hit group and use it. It doesn't have to be flown by one specialized guy like a Bayraktar would be. I mean, these things are tiny. I've watched the video on them. They're not very big.
Yeah,
I think
but
that's a really
again,
good point.
Again, they each have their uses. It's not going to be a
yeah,
one size fits all.
yeah, and that's where I agree with you in saying, but like that's I think more the point I'm trying to emphasize is the line between this defensive and offensive is a really thick line, and it's not very difficult to distinguish the differences between both those drones and both their capabilities. One of them is in a completely different strategic square.
So, moving on from air assets and air defense, is Ukraine receiving enough aid in general? Does the aid package that was announced today meet the requirements of Ukraine's armed forces and humanitarian relief?
I think they could definitely use a lot more in the realm of lethal aid and defensive aid. I would also like to see them get maybe some more electronic warfare equipment at their disposal. That would probably help as well if they could get kind of a leg up in the information space on the ground there in Ukraine. That would definitely benefit them greatly. One thing I found interesting in those numbers. The U.S. is sending 5,000 rifles, but only 1,000 handguns, which is interesting. You think they would be able to send an equal amount of rifles and handguns. I thought that was a little interesting. I feel like those numbers could have been a lot higher. The U.S. has a lot of rifles and a lot of handguns, and we could have spared to probably even double or triple those numbers. I mean, ammunition. They're getting a lot of ammunition. They can always use more in that realm. Medical supplies as well is something that they're really needing a lot more of, and kind of the logistical medical infrastructure that they need to set up things like field hospitals and triages and things like that.
I follow a British guy on TikTok who is he's somewhere right outside of Kiev, and he's working with a group back in Britain for getting AFAC um, backpacks to hand out. He said they're really short-handed. I can't remember what it stands for, but basically they're a portable med kit for a soldier. And he said that they're struggling to get those. So that would be something fairly easy, but that's something that can be open sourced, donations and things like that. I don't think the governments need to focus more on the offensive and defensive weapons and let the open sourcing help with the medical and things, except for your larger things, like you said, setting up field hospitals and stuff.
So just to give everybody a little bit of uh, uh, kind of information here on the terminology used there. AFAC stands for Advanced First Aid Kit. It has a little bit more. So your typical first aid kit is like your IFAC, IFAK stands for Individual First Aid Kit. That's what your typical infantry soldier would carry on his person. An AFAC, also known as an Advanced First Aid Kit, is a little bit more in depth. Medics would be carrying something like this. That comes with things like defibrillators, plastic casts for severe fractures, life-saving medications, things like more. A lot more capabilities for like stopping bleeds and things like that. You also have MFACs, which MFAK stands for Multiple First Aid Kit as well. So just a little bit of insight there as to that terminology.
Yeah, just a quick statement. It's one thing saying like we gotta get it there, and then it's another thing actually getting it there. And there's proof that sadly Russians have been targeting these humanitarian aid convoys, and um, it's like because they have crap food too. They're leaving their food trucks behind with potatoes, onions, and pickles, and that's all they got. So
I think yeah, I think that's a really good point. The humanitarian situation on the ground is awful. If you can imagine, people who haven't been able to flee from places like Mariupol, Kiev, other than those who volunteered to stay, are the elderly, the people, the infirm, people who can't move very far, disabled people. So those people are suffering from a lack of food. Mariupol, I mean, it's got no food, no water, no power, no electricity, no heating at this time of the year there. So I think what's really needed also is the humanitarian relief side of things. I hate to refer to the Berlin airlift, but there should definitely be more spent on the humanitarian relief side of things. I was watching an interview with the World from the United Nations, the World Food Organization, the chief. Channel 4 in the UK was doing interview with him, and he was saying that they are $1 billion short, more than $1 billion short in being able to provide food for starving children and starving civilians throughout the world, but particularly Ukraine. And what they have to do is, because they have such a small amount of resources, they have to shift it and basically say, okay, these people starving in Afghanistan or these people starving in Ethiopia, we're going to shift those resources to help people in Ukraine. Definitely more things can be done, and I agree with you on the. I think more can. I'm surprised at the numbers. I mean, I would assume there's huge stockpiles of weapons. I put up an article in the Situation Room. As of last year, there was a huge stockpiles of M4A1s. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to send the whole stockpile, but surely there's a lot of weapons and even older style weapons that are in the U.S. Army inventory that could be sent. I think 5,000 doesn't really help too much for all volunteers and all the people who've been conscripted. So there's a massive amount of conscripts and such out there who don't have anything really.
The other thing to keep in mind is that's our aid package. What are other countries providing as far as, you know, guns and pistols and things on top of what we're providing? I haven't heard anything on that.
I know Australia has provided offensive and defensive equipment. A lot of this, unfortunately, is there's no easy way to, unless someone has a. Does anyone have an easy way or an easy reference in relation to how much has been sent to Ukraine so far?
It's a difficult thing to track among all the other noise going on in this conflict. I mean, some of us only have so much mental bandwidth to track individual things.
Keep in mind, the governments like it that way at this point. They don't want Russia to know exactly how much we are giving them and what we're giving them. So
There is a Wikipedia, if you just search up Ukraine humanitarian aid that has been given by countries. There's a Wikipedia page about all the humanitarian aid given.
Back to the AFACs, actually, to the medical equipment. A member in our Discord server, Vasche1965, actually just mentioned in the general chat that the Red Cross ordered 10 by 40 foot shipping containers of AFAC hazmat service packs to send to Eastern Europe 2 weeks ago, according to a source, Canadian Prepper, I believe. This also includes tents and gas masks. Oh, hazmats. Okay, hazmats. That's what he said. So AFAC and hazmats. I'd like us to see us get a confirmation, a source on that. I could get that up on screen. Here, actually, sorry. Here's another list. List of foreign aid to Ukraine during the Russo-Ukrainian war here that I have on screen. This might be useful.
I think we just double posted
It's a
that by
lo-
accident, sorry.
It's a lot. Like it is a lot that is listed.
Belgium gave 2,000 assault rifles. Brazil sent stuff. Bulgaria conducted more than 600 courses and trained more than 33,000 Ukrainian troops since September of 2015. So yeah, this has been on. This list is since 2014, I believe.
So, moving on, the reconstruction of Ukraine in the days following the end of the conflict is going to be a colossal effort. How much aid and what sort of aid packages should we give to Ukraine to help them rebuild after the conflict ends?
I think there's going to be a weird shift in the event of this, and this is obviously a speculation in terms of the nature of the question itself, but the ties between both Russia and Ukraine regarding the breadbasket of Europe phrase that we've been hearing thrown around a lot in terms of what they export for wheat, in terms of fertilizer, ammonia, how ammonia is made, the export of ammonia. This is a really critical question that I don't think is getting enough light, so I'm glad it's being asked. Um, a lot of the imports of ammonia for Ukraine come from Russia, funnily enough, and Russia is one of the biggest exporters for ammonia as a um, fertilizer. That word escaped me then. As a fertilizer, because it actually requires a tremendous amount of natural gas to create ammonia, and obviously that's something we know Russia has an abundance of at the moment. That's completely broken down during this conflict, and that's obviously tying into all the sanctions and the economic connections between Russia and Ukraine that we previously had, being completely eradicated. So I'd be curious to see what the situation is going to be there in terms of maintaining or upholding that kind of stability in Ukraine in order for them to continue their production of wheat and farming.
Yeah, I completely agree. Farming is going to be a massive one, but also I think getting people on the ground who builders, people who know how to build, people know who have the wood. The food supplies need to be redone. Whole cities have been obliterated. So far, villages have been obliterated. So Mariupol, God knows how that's going to look when actual full images of everything come out. At the moment, it's like the siege of Leningrad there at the moment, which I think at the biggest thing is not just money, because if you look at the Balkans after the Yugoslav wars, or if you look at any other conflict zone around the world that's happened after World War II, there's been a lot of money thrown at the problem, but not enough on the ground support. So I think there has to be a lot of thinking, not just about money, but about on the boots on the ground sort of thing. Not boots as in military boots, but civilian contractors, people who know how to build, engineers, that sort of stuff. That can actually help them rebuild a lot of these cities. And then, of course, experts in agriculture and such to help them with their farming industry as well. And then you will need to also get nuclear experts in there to. There's going to be a lot of time and effort to look at those nuclear reactors to ensure that, especially the ones that have been captured, to ensure that they're all 100% before it actually goes online again. Even though they're currently being monitored, that doesn't mean that they're fully operational. So
Trying. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, take into account that this conflict is 3 weeks old. We don't know what it's going to look like in a week or a month or a year from now. So it's hard to plan on the rebuild when honestly Russia isn't through blowing it up.
I
We
think
don't
that's a
know
good
we don't
point.
know what that's going to look like until we get closer to a settlement.
Thank you. Exactly.
Speaking.
The average is about 5 years to bounce back economically to pre-war states of output and production. So, but that's kind of just over the data we've built from ancient warfare, well, not ancient, but the beginnings of modern warfare until now. This is something that has a lot of factors into it, and I don't know if we're going to see that same 5 years.
All very valid points. I just thought it was an interesting topic to bring up and discuss because I haven't heard anyone talk about it yet. Continuing on in the discussion, how long do we think the sanctions against Russia will be in place? I'm not talking about them ending during the conflict. I'm talking about the punitive period after the conflict ends.
I don't personally think we are going to see a return to normality in terms of the relationship between the West and Russia economically ever again, um, unless there is a change of hands as far as the current regime in Russia.
I feel like there's going to be some kind of list that they're going to hand Russia and say you're going to have to. Here's the list. As you meet these goals, we'll remove this sanction and this sanction and this sanction.
I think they're going to have to completely clear house with who's running the operations in Russia before any sort of talks for uh, sanctions to be lifted.
Let's put
I
it this way.
honestly,
America still has an embargo on Cuba, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. We
yeah,
tend to hold a grudge.
But keep in
I don't.
mind that the thing is this has been a NATO, for lack of a better description, led thing. Everybody's trying to work together. I read an article today where the Biden was explaining to the Democrats that, hey, the reason I had you guys hold up on the oil and gas was because I wanted to coordinate it with our other allies.
My only
And
theory is if that. Sorry.
no, and I feel like the rollback of the sanctions will kind of be the same thing. It will be in coordination with each other. Seems our weakest link right now is going to be Hungary.
What I mean to
I
say is just if that is an example of how long we can take it. But yeah, I don't think that'll ever go that far. It was, this is different.
I don't know how long sanctions against Russia will be in place.
I'm just giving you the historical longest one.
I just wanted to say that I just posted an article in the Situation Room from Politico as of not long ago, as in an hour ago, or 14 hours ago, I believe. But Blinken said that irreversible withdrawal necessary to lift sanctions on Russia. I know that the Europeans have talked about a full withdrawal from Ukraine is required in order for sanctions to be lifted. Now, the veracity of the sanctions that would be lifted would depend on, of course, on what Russia does. I mean, does irreversible mean getting out of Crimea as well? Because that's currently not a subject or topic of conversation in the current peace talks happening. So that's a good question, Mike. Does that mean that Russia gets out of Crimea as well? Probably not. But yeah, so I think if Russia wants the sanctions completely gone, they would need to get out of Ukraine proper, as in Crimea and the rest of the country with all their troops. Then the sanctions will be lifted. At that stage, I'm sure there's still going to be sanctions that remain that have been put on Russia prior to the war in Ukraine. The US and other countries had sanctions against them prior to the war in Ukraine. But all these really big sanctions, such as the SWIFT sanctions and the sanctions against their oil and natural gas that has occurred recently, I think that will go, because Europe will be happy if that happens, of course, because a lot of their trade comes from, or a large amount of their trade comes from Russia, and a large amount of their natural gas and energy for at least the foreseeable future, the short to medium term, will it comes from Russia. Now it's an emergency to find an alternative to that. So yeah, that's from what's been reported in the news and what countries have said about those sanctions.
So I'd like to move on. Let's hypothetically say that Russia undergoes a sudden regime change and Putin is kaput. Should the West consider enacting a sort of Marshall Plan esque aid package for Russia to sow the seeds of long term peace and stability?
Depending on who they choose to put in there, I would see that as a possibility because that is the one place we failed in the 90s when the Berlin Wall fell. We did not push hard enough um, for democracy to stick. We didn't stay behind it at all times. I read an interesting article the other day from Boris Yeltsin's ambassador to the UN, and he said, it was like the West was all rah rah, everything's great, and he said then after a year or two, it just kind of fell off the wagon, and the people didn't feel supported to make that transition. So I think if they had a complete regime change, then something like that could possibly be on the table because it'd be a worldwide lift. It wouldn't just be the United States.
I
Which I
think
don't think is realistic. I think this is hoping for like a best case scenario in terms of changing fundamental cores of the systems and regimes currently in place in Russia, which I don't see moving anytime soon, despite current speculations of obviously things being quite uneasy and there being divisions within the the FSB. We're seeing the same thing in Ukraine. You've got to remember there's obviously always going to be opposition within governments against decisions being made. That's nothing new, but to what scale? That is the question. If that scale is big enough, similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, are we going to see something similar like that? Which I've been saying for a long time is I think a best case scenario from all of this is that this is a big enough strategic blunder and a big enough hit to Russia's economy and stability that forces a precedent within their regime um, to basically give Putin an ultimatum and say, look, we've got to change things here, or well, basically that's it. That's the ultimatum. We have to change things here in order so that Russia's not screwed, basically. But just so unlikely though with how Putin is approaching this.
I think a Marshall Plan would be great, but it would really depend on, like's been said, on who's in at that time. I think the biggest risk, and probably it's as dangerous as nuclear escalation or de-escalation of this conflict, is if Putin is taken away from power and there's a dramatic change in government. Because how does that happen? Is that via a popular revolution? Is that via someone from the military taking over? There's a lot of dangers that are involved in that. If my analysis is that if there is an orange revolution in Russia, that's so much so that a democracy can prevail, and the current democratic leader in jail in Russia, his name escapes me at the moment, he would be released and he would step up to the plate of leading Russia. I think that would be the perfect example where you could go, okay, we need a Marshall Plan here. Let's really help Russia as much as possible to integrate democratically into the international way of things. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, I think that's probably wishful thinking. Unfortunately, whoever takes over, there's going to be a very tumultuous change of government if it happens, and it's going to be very dangerous. And I think everyone will have to hold their breath until there's some sort of stability in Russia before that can happen.
I think what corroborates what you're saying in terms of that instability and risk involved with that is assessing what we know from the previous collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and how a lot of analysts of what happened during that very turbulent time will tell you that exchange of power and that collapse was the most dangerous time during the Cold War because it creates a power vacuum in which there's no real accountability when it comes to true decision making within the country. So although we don't like Putin at the moment, at least we have something to pin things on in terms of following the playbook and kind of playing the chessboard. But when we're talking about the complete collapse of a country like that, we're talking about throwing all the chess pieces off the board completely and somehow surgically putting those pieces back on in an appropriate way that doesn't risk throwing the entire game out the window.
I think there's a risk that there's going to be, in my opinion, just from my analysis, there's a risk that there could be. Russians love revolutions in the 20th century. How many? There was 3 revolutions.
Yeah,
So,
they're the trendsetters.
yeah,
for
they're the
sure.
trendsetters. That's for sure. Look, people over there are struggling. Russian citizens are the ones struggling from all these sanctions and everything else. You know, you can imagine. You know, we struggle with going to the fuel pump and looking at it and going, wow, this is really expensive. And then just imagine Russians going to the grocery store and going, oh wow, I can't afford half of this. You know, I have to half my groceries. So you know, there was something I watched in Russian news or somewhere that was saying that some of them just have to. They can't feed their whole family. There's tough choices to make. So I think yeah, unless you live in rural Russia where you might have a farm and you can have your own pigs and such and grow your own vegetables, I think everyone in the cities would be extremely angry. As time goes on, that anger will rise, and there'll just be a lot of there's going to be a growing instability in Russia as it keeps crumbling economically.
To kind of add on to what DoDar was talking about, imagine that there is an uprising in Russia, and instead of someone falling into the position to lead the entire country, the country breaks up into even smaller states. And you've got autocrats and fascists and democracies just spread out across the landmass. Think about what a mess that's going to be because they're all going to have nuclear weapons.
But on that note, although this is quite a counterproductive thing to say and maybe a destructive thing to say, it's still a relevant saying today, and it's divide and conquer. And if we're truly going down the narrative rabbit hole of dissolving Russia's current regime, these are very real potential consequences, and the end game here is basically not having a regime that is so isolated and not representative of the people that are beneath it. That this is the risk, is having so much power with one person. You know, the outcome of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 led to a lot of beautiful countries which, you know, you can't turn your nose up at.
So this is a very deep rabbit hole that is not the most productive, I would say. It's an interesting
Yeah.
thing to ponder, but I'd like to move on to a topic that was brought up in the Center for Strategic and International Studies interview with ranking Foreign Affairs Committee member uh, McCall. And one of the topics in that interview was that there are 2 narratives surrounding the state of the Russian front lines. The first narrative being that Russia's halt is temporary. They have slowed down due to fierce resistance, but their forces are largely intact. The opposing narrative is that they are in much worse shape than we currently assess them to be, and certain areas are not just in a stalemate, but are facing partial front collapse. What is the panel's thoughts on these competing narratives?
I
I
think there's
personally
going to
think we
go ahead.
I personally think we haven't seen the tip of the iceberg with Russia's army.
I agree with that. I think that what we're seeing right now is a reconsolidation of forces. And keep in mind, Putin is dragging everyone in from around the world that he can to do this. So it's not going to be a cohesive army that attacks. But I think that I think there's going to be one more huge push to try to overrun everything at some point, unless the Ukrainians can continue to stall them and bog them up and things like that. But if they get their forces consolidated, then we're probably going to see another one big huge push.
I would have to concur on that. on that statement as well.
I'm on two fences because from my recent analysis of what's going on one side I think that if you look at the list that was referred to in the previous panel, I believe that was sent to us and it was put on in the Situation Room. If you look through that list, a lot of the equipment is old Soviet era equipment, or Soviet era equipment. You have some new Russian equipment, and there's been a lot of new Russian equipment go into the fray. There's one part of me from the analysis of that list and knowledge of what Russia does have that they have huge amounts in reserve. And what Putin's doing is theater, like puppet theater. You know, like, oh, look at us, we're actually failing, but in the real sense, he's got a lot in the reserve. But on the other hand, I have had discussions with some military experts that I know who have been serving in the military, and they said to me that if you look at the condition of even some of Russia's newest equipment go in, it's poorly maintained, it's poorly run. They only have 100 supply trucks. I think the US military has an extensive supply network. You know, if you look at the ability to maintain those vehicles and ensure that the maintenance of those vehicles are to the highest standard possible, so that they're combat ready, it shows that they were on war games, as we all know, before the Ukrainian war on the border, and then they've been pushed into Ukraine at not 100% in 100% conditions. So, you know, talking to them, this is clearly he's already put his best stuff in, and now he's trying to get the dregs in as well. So I'm on both fences, and it's because there's no 100% clarity as to this. A lot of it comes, unfortunately, down to speculation and analysis from experts that can be referred to from articles and such. But there's no, of course, Russia's very secretive, and we don't at the fog of war and the information war. I think it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of what we're hearing from both ends. There's such a huge information war going on. It's very hard to know exactly the condition of the armed forces on the ground, but it could be either. Is my answer to the question.
I'd like
Thanks.
to bring up the response of Ranking House Foreign Affairs Committee Representative McCall, who responded to that question saying that we see a bit of both depending on the area of the front line. I believe that in the north, some of the encircled cities are beginning to expand the radius in which they are encircled and could potentially connect back up to the main Ukrainian lines. That's pure speculation and going off of live UA maps and the Scribble maps. But I do believe that there are places where the supply chain has broken down so severely that parts of the Russian front line could be collapsing in the coming weeks. However, there's extreme Russian strength in the south, and I do believe that we will see further Russian advances in the south.
I think what we're actually seeing to be more in line with what we've been told, surprisingly, by Russia, if you want to believe what they're saying, is what their agenda actually is in terms of priorities. So we're talking about the denazification of Ukraine. We're talking about Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course Crimea. And as far as any kind of territorial war that's taking place, again, if we're following the narrative that Russia is, doing this special military operation, and I'm doing like the Dr. Evil finger from Austin Powers, the special military operation, then that's, I think, the reason why we're seeing the build-up predominantly and the strength predominantly in the south, is because if we're to see any kind of retention after a pullback, where we're least likely to see an entire pullback is going to be in the south.
So we've all heard that China or that Russia has been requesting lethal and economic aid from China. I'd like to ask the panel what their opinions are about what that request says about the current state of Russia's ability to make progress in this war. Does this request um, imply that they are running out of their critical logistics material? Does this request uh, is it a ploy to make China pick a side and pull it away from its neutrality? What do you guys think?
May I comment on that?
Absolutely.
The whole idea, the whole idea of it being in need of any materials is a fallacy. It is purely a political thing. Nearly every country in the West has basically signed an alliance, whereas the biggest majority of Asian countries, the alliances between them are still quite broken. And what I think he's trying to reassure himself with is they've not left him in the lurch and they will back him. It's a purely political thing. I don't think there's any actual need for any relief from China.
So I don't know if anybody was following today, but keep in mind, I feel like China will play both sides against the middle. So let me open this statement with that. But China's ambassador to Ukraine came out today and gave this long rambling speech. Well, not long rambling speech, but he gave a speech saying that China was a friend of Ukraine and they were going to provide them humanitarian aid and they were not going to get involved. That they believed in the Ukrainians defending their sovereign land. The odd part was the Belarus president Lukashenko was flying from Moscow to China as that speech was made, and his plane turned around and came back after that speech was made and never went to China. So that in and of itself might say something about the relationship that Russia is having with China right now.
I think it's a very good point, Morlock. I think you make some great points because, um, yeah, and that speech I heard about it as well, and I think that's a key that is a key signal in my opinion as to what they're saying, what China's position is because China's position, as we all know, if we say openly, "Oh, what's happening in Xinjiang is Holocaust, is genocide," or criticize China in another way about Hong Kong, etc., they immediately play the sovereignty card. They throw it down and go, "Well, that's our national sovereignty. You can't you can't muck around with our sovereign ability to what's in our sovereignty is Chinese and it's none of your business." I think that's exactly why that statement was made is to reassure everyone that you know, on one hand, that they're not going to get involved. On the other hand, I put an article from the American ABC News, whether it's how plausible it is for Chinese military aid in Russia to be sent, and I think in that article, there's a lot of references to what has been announced by American officials and others about that. I think the key thing is publicly they're going to be saying that they're not going to get involved. They respect the sovereignty, etc., etc. On the other hand, though, I wouldn't be surprised if it's aid to Russia is going to be some spare parts, spare tank parts, that sort of thing. Different type of aid that isn't necessarily here's a tank, here's a gun, but here are parts and mechanical sort of things. So they can kind of play both sides. And people, by sending that equipment that equipment, you could also argue it to be used on civilian projects as well. But of course, it will be used militarily. So I think there will be some sort of covert assistance there, but it definitely won't be Chinese troops on the ground or Chinese equipment on the ground. I don't see that happening because they know that if they do that, their economy is going to go to shit. 60% of their exports go to the US. I think 30% or 20% goes to Europe. Everything's made in China. All of their shit collapses. I'm sorry to swear. Sorry, my apologies. I said it twice. And yeah, so sorry.
So,
Naughty.
so one thing to keep in mind that came up with China was at the beginning of this, the whole information warfare part of it. The United States kept saying Russia's going to attack. Here's our intel, blah blah blah. Then we come out and we say, well, our intel is hearing that Russia's requested aid from China, and almost immediately the Chinese stock market tanks. And Xi Jinping saw that, I think, and backed up. It made him blink because his whole hold on power is money. Every article I've read says, because he's up for re-election. Now it's communist, but he's still up for re-election, and if they tank their stock market at this point, he will not get re-elected.
What we've seen as well in the recent days is I think it was Dubai, United Arab Emirates, speculating on actually paying for actually selling oil for yen to China. So we're watching a transition happening in the shadows of this, which, despite what's happening here, has already been happening and ongoing in terms of like the potential for Chinese yen becoming the new I can't remember the word for it, reserve currency. Because if they can play the long game, then they will, because nobody's arguing about the fact that China is huge in terms of its economic power and how it currently stands in the world economic field. And I want to highlight as well and bring it back down to Ukraine and Russia in saying that China does have vested interests in Ukraine. One example of that is back in 2014. China was playing Ukraine off against China via grain exports and was actually turning away United States grain exports because it was genetically modified, and instead signing deals, massive trade deals to import corn from Ukraine. So Ukraine has a lot of assets that are beneficial to China, as well as the more obvious things that we're looking at in terms of their economy and how that's structured in terms of their dependency on the West.
Yeah, I agree. Someone in the YouTube chat said China is going to do what is best for China and China territory, nothing more, nothing less. I agree with
Yeah.
that statement.
Yeah, it's all about China number one. 100%. That is the entire mentality of the Xi Jinping regime.
Yeah. Keep in mind also, someone mentioned Russian wheat to China, but because of this war, Russia imports 40% of their seed stock in wheat and 90% of their seed stock in potatoes. So Russia's going to have a hard time this year, and there are actual fears that there's going to be a famine in the Middle East because of it, because they exported a lot of their wheat and things to the Middle East.
The fertilizer alone is a big concern from
The
Ukraine.
ammonium nitrate.
Yeah,
I agree.
So
I don't think they could.
They stopped the exports of ammonia from Ukraine when this whole thing kicked off. So we're already looking at a level of shortage in the Middle East. Even if this was to stop, like, snap your fingers right now, we are already
Right.
experiencing that. This is just a matter of every day that goes by and every single day that this consists. It's going to get worse and worse.
Oh yeah, and it's going to snowball. It's going to affect regions and things that people did not think of at the beginning.
Yeah.
So moving on from Chinese aid, um, there was recently a group of U.S. Congresspeople that made a trip to the Polish border with Ukraine to see the refugee camps firsthand. Among these members was the Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member McCall and committee chairman Meeks. And yesterday, during an interview, um, Representative McCall said that after Chairman Meeks saw the humanitarian devastation in person, he shifted his ethos from disapproving of sending weapons to any country as a general rule and became convicted that we must stand together and do everything in our power to help these people. Representative McCall was also quoted saying uh, that during events of this magnitude, partisanship must take a back seat and that congressional resolve has never been stronger. So, my question for the panel is: are we witnessing a renewed period of bipartisanship cooperation in Congress? And if so, how long do we think that might last?
I think I'll leave this one to the Americans.
I think I've definitely seen a change. I have seen there being a lot more reaching across the aisle, and it actually seems like we may end up with more of a centrist party after this. But that is, of course, my speculation.
I'm gonna have to disagree with that. I think bipartisanism in America is mostly a ploy, and it's mostly employed in times of crisis or in times of war. I mean, I think as soon as the situation quiets down, we'll be right back at each other's throats. That's just how American politics goes.
Yeah, I see it as being short-lived. There'll be a few things that they can all rally around, but it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's you're not seeing any great change in any other front other than Ukraine.
Well, what I mean to say is, especially amongst the Republican Party, there's been a huge divide because of prior support for Putin. So, I agree. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is lofty to think that we might end up a centrist party out of this, but as opposed to maybe getting rid of the bad actors amongst the conservatives and getting back to it just being about conservative economics versus liberal economics and not about morals.
But keep in mind
Yeah.
that that you saw a shift because initially everybody was Putin's best friend, and then they saw the American public come out in backing the Ukrainians, and suddenly that whole section of that party shifted their message,
But isn't that the way politics is
with the
supposed to work?
exception of a few.
But that's the exact way
That,
politics is supposed to work. They're supposed to listen to us.
but the wind will blow the other way, and they will be the first ones with a kite in the air.
Ivy
I
was
tend
going
to
to say
agree.
something. Sorry. Ivy, did you want to say something? I saw your mic go on. Going to say something?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I have to disagree as well. I think even currently, there was a whole list of Republicans who voted against federal funding that would support Ukraine. So I think I agree with Morlock with what you were saying, that it's some of the low-hanging fruit, but I think it is just that when it gets back down to other things, there's, a long list of the like Republicans versus Democratic talking points that still stand, that remain unchanged.
What I would like to add from it, I'll add it my international perspective. All I want to say is I hope that I like the fact that I can see from an external perspective the Republicans, Democrats working together, and instead of there being such a huge divide that just kind of goes bigger and bigger, and then it just causes more division. So maybe my hope is, as an international observer, that maybe this will create some sort of positive change or some positivity, I guess you could say. I mean, everyone will have different sides. Everyone is always either on the conservative side or the liberal side or whatever. Everyone's got different opinions, but I hope this can cause some positive influence on because you guys are, I guess, the USA for me as an Australian is a should be a shining example of republicanism. as a republic, and I think that well, I hope it does help you guys mend some rifts.
I agree with that.
Thank you, Americans.
So, my final question for the panel is, if the situation in Ukraine does evolve into an insurgency / occupation dynamic, does the West continue to provide lethal aid? And if so, where is the off ramp for this conflict?
Absolutely. We will it will be Afghanistan, Russian Afghanistan 2.0 for us. We will feed them weapons and let them run the Russians through a meat grinder until and if one side finally puts an end to it.
I think this
I believe we would. Go ahead.
I think this highlights why, despite finding it hard to believe the Russian narrative of special military operation, again, I'm doing the Dr. Evil fingers there. It's a low bar, you know. They've not set out of the gate saying we're gonna smash Ukraine, we're gonna take Ukraine, and Ukraine's gonna join the Russian Federation. Like they haven't been saying anything like that. You know, they've just said denazification, which we know that there isn't it's not a hard victory for them to claim in their their sphere of influence, of them to say, yeah, we got all the Nazis. Yeah, what Nazis? Oh well, the Azov Battalion or whatever, the small sect of maybe what might represent that narrative, which is still speculative to whether or not it warrants true justification for what they're saying. And I'm not talking about justification for the invasion. I'm talking about justification to even say that that's a problem in the first place, right? So that's a small victory right there. And then we're talking about land integrity when it comes to Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, right? And Ukraine is going to either have to bend on the land, or they are going to continue to fight, or Russia's going to have to pull out. These are the only things that I see happening in this situation, or a complete escalation into like doomsday, which is, I think, super unlikely, of course.
I believe that guerrilla forces in Ukraine, if there is a full occupation of the state, of the nation, would be funded fairly stoutly by the U.S. government to not only assist them, but to vest their own interest.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I really think that the West is never going to stop funding Ukraine or arming Ukraine, regardless of whether or not Russia fully occupies the territory. And then if I could just comment on the statement that someone made earlier about Russia's claims that they just want to denazify Ukraine. I mean, before the invasion started, they said that the West was being hysterical and that they would never invade Ukraine. So I don't think taking the Russians at their word is very it's not a very smart thing to do, you know. I really think that they want to take the whole country just based on their avenues of attack.
Well, I would say to the contrary in that, in terms of their avenues of attack. My logical approach on that would be the South is obviously the land dispute, and the very different blitzkrieg like approach that we're seeing in the North is purely to put pressure on the military centers of Kiev because of its population density and its importance to the centrality of the country itself. I don't think we're seeing a sign of a full scale occupation here just yet, unless we start to see a movement down from the north coming from Belarus. I think then the questions would be raised in regards to that kind of thing taking place. But otherwise, all that we would see is a core movement of military power move to the west, and then we would see a constant frontline fight stretching from Poland all the way through Lviv and all the way across to Kiev.
I'm
My
not.
pers-
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I'm not sure if the. I'm not. I don't know what your name is, dude. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure if you're aware that that the Russians actually already have moved down from the north from Belarus, and that's one of their major avenues of attack against Kiev. And there have even been forces battling inside of Kiev itself.
Yeah, I'm not talking about, dude. The the Belarusian border is a big border, and I know obviously they're coming from the north. Objectively speaking, they fulfill that criteria, but I'm talking about a full scale occupation of Ukraine and what would fulfill that criteria in terms of troop movement and how we're not seeing it further westward.
what I wanted to say, just on that topic, and in relation to that, I guess both of you guys have an interesting perspective on this, because I think it's important to, well, firstly, to answer the question, I think military funds and all the armaments will keep going, but I think it's worth to note whether those funds and those armaments will continue into Ukraine if it's completely invaded, or whether it's completely invaded. One has to look at the past, and what Russia has done and said, in my opinion, and then we can even look at historical examples of that. I mean, I think the perfect quote here is: "War is simply the continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means," as said by Karl von Clausewitz. And from that perspective, if we go back a couple of months when there was the extensive diplomatic flurry between Moscow, Washington, Brussels, there was a lot of talk and a lot of uh, discussions between the West, NATO in particular, and Russia. And Russia made it very clear what they want is NATO to go back to the levels of the 1990s. They made it very clear that they want everyone who was put into the NATO to be neutral, and for Ukraine to be neutral, etc., etc. But the main point was to go back in time, because in Putin's mind and in Russia's mind, from their, if we refer to their statement and what they wanted, what they the statement of demands they provided to the West and NATO, we can see that their demands are vastly more greater than Ukraine. So if Ukraine is invaded, I think there will be an underground battle conflict going on. But I think Putin will go further. Whether he goes into Moldova, he's going to look at any other neutral territory, so he doesn't have to trigger Article 5 to go for, whether it's Ukraine or Finland or whoever else, just so he can continue that sphere of influence that he desperately wants. I think that based on what they've said in their historical, Russia's historical actions, they might even go into NATO. Who knows? But I think um, uh, the people in Ukraine who are suffering and continue to suffer, this goes on for months and months and months. It's the destruction is unimaginable, and they're going to fight tooth and nail underground. They're going to be partisans like Yugoslavia was partisans during World War II, like Romanians and Hungarians and the French were partisans fighting tooth and nail to get their country back. You know what I mean? So I don't see any situation where countries like Australia, and as an Australian citizen, I definitely would tell my government to be helping to fund Ukraine if that was happening, because that would just be an illegal invasion by Russia. But yeah, I think we need to think about the fact that Putin's now using war as a means of getting his political ends, and in that sense, I think there needs to be a lot more strategic thinking on that point.
Well, all right. I believe with that that will conclude all of our updates. Am I right, Desmo? Do you have another update, or sorry, another topic for us, or is that all?
I think that's a good place to leave it for tonight.
Alrighty. Yeah, I think this talk tonight went very well. Again, I would like to thank all of our panel guests tonight. We're going to take a moment now. If anybody would like to introduce themselves or plug anything that they may have, now is the time to do so.
Also, if any of the panel members have a book to recommend to the viewers, this is also the time to do so.
So I've got a book that I recommend everybody read. And it is War is a Racket by General Smedley D. Butler.
That's a great book. That's a great book, ladies and gentlemen.
I have a book I'd like to recommend. My name is Desmo. I'm a moderator in the Discord, and I head up the writing team for this panel. The book I'd like to recommend is called Spy Handler, Memoir of a KGB Officer. This book is a memoir of the KGB Colonel Viktor Cherashkin, who recruited both Robert Hansen and Aldrich Ames, two of the most damaging traitors in U.S. intelligence history. It's an excellent book if you want to have a deeper understanding of both the Russian intelligence mindset and the Soviet political machinery.
Very interesting. Would anybody else like to go ahead?
I have a fun-hearted read if you are ever curious about the U.S. presidents. It's called How to Fight U.S. Presidents by Daniel O'Brien. It's informative and does touch on some of the historical events from World War II, but more than that, it's funny. And I think we all need a laugh right now.
I can agree with that. If anybody else in the panel would like to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think on the principles of what Clausewitz talks about in his very 19th century but quite universal principles. I think Clausewitz in the 21st century by Hugh Strachan and Andreas Heber-Groth, I think is a very good read if you want to know more about Clausewitz and how it's important to understand his theories in the 21st century.
All right. Would anybody else like to go ahead? Anything to plug or introduce yourself? All right, then I think that wraps it up for tonight. Again, you guys were just tuning in there to our open panel, open mic discussion here. Again, an ongoing experiment as we try kind of some new formats here with these open community discussions. Again, for those of you asking if you would like to join in on these discussions, you can head over to our Discord server at discord.gg/NEMICO. And if you are active in contributing to the general chat channel, which anybody has access to, over time you will gain the voice rank, which will allow you to join in on some of these open mic discussions. We are looking for people that have insightful knowledge and experience in a variety of different fields. If you believe you have something to bring to the table, I encourage you to head on over to the Discord and start contributing to the discussions in our general chat channels. From there, you could then get a spot here on one of these open mic panel discussions. Again, I would like to thank all of our mods, all of the panel all of the panel members tonight, and as well as Desmo for heading up the writing on tonight's discussions. This panel discussion will be uploaded to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/NEMICO Network as soon as this discussion is over. Again, I thank everybody for tuning in at home, and until next time, again, this was the Situation Room open mic discussions here on the NEMICO Network YouTube channel. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. Thank you so much to everybody that tuned in tonight for these talks. You guys were amazing. I believe this talk went just as well, if not better, than our last talk.
Yeah, thank you, Omnissiah.
Thank you, Epi. Glad to have you.
But may I add to the book thing? I did say the name Dark Nature by Lyle Watson. It's actually Dark Nature, a natural history of evil. The man wrote a few good books like Supernature 2. They're a good read.
Well, right on. That's very insightful. Also, I will add as well, if anybody has any links they want me to include in the description of this panel discussion on YouTube when I upload it, I will include any links that you guys want to send over into that description below the video. Again, guys, if you are interested in any of the sources or anything, if you're looking for a link to the Discord, you can find all that information in the descriptions below the video. If you're watching this in video form once it's been uploaded, you can also find that information below the live streams as well. If you're following along and you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button to get notified to our latest updates when videos go live and when streams go live. Also hit that like button if you can. It really helps a lot. If you're following along on Twitch, hit the follow button. Thank everybody for tuning in again this evening. But until next time.